When Lucas Bryant first saw the mountain, it didn't look like much to anyone else. To him, it was freedom, a long stretch of untouched wilderness rising above the timberline, where wind and silence ruled without argument. He had spent most of his life surrounded by noise, conference rooms, traffic, deadlines that never let him sleep. Buying this land was his way out, a promise to himself that he would live differently. The mountain wasn't simply property. It was a blank page. The paperwork took nearly a year, tangled in county approvals and zoning maps that hadn't been updated since the 70s. Yet, when the final signature dried and the land was officially his, Lucas felt something he hadn't in years: certainty. He was finally standing on soil that belonged to him and no one else. He moved into a small cabin left by the previous owner, a ranger who had once used it as a weather station. The structure creaked in the wind, the stove smoked every morning, and the plumbing was primitive. But Lucas didn't mind. He spent his days hiking the ridgelines, recording changes in soil and vegetation for his environmental reports, and in the evenings he would sit on the porch with a notebook and sketch the curve of the valley below. A few hikers passed during the summer, and once a forestry truck rolled by, but no one stayed long enough to disturb him. The mountain seemed immune to the world's chaos. Then, late in autumn, he noticed a wooden stake at the edge of his road. Bright orange paint, a plastic flag fluttering in the wind. At first, he thought it was an old boundary marker. But 2 weeks later, a new one appeared farther up, and another after that. They traced a clean line across his property, stopping just below the ridge. He called the county office to check if a new survey was underway, but they had no record of any authorized work. "Probably a mapping mistake," the clerk said. Lucas accepted the answer, though something about the flags unsettled him. By December, heavy machinery began appearing on the lower slope, earth movers and trucks carrying long steel beams. The workers told him they were part of a community infrastructure project, approved by the local homeowners association. Lucas laughed at the idea. There were no homes here, only forest and rock. Still, the sight of fresh tire tracks winding across his land was difficult to ignore. When he tried to explain that the area was privately owned, the crew chief simply shrugged and pointed to a laminated map on his clipboard. The mountain, it showed, was part of a planned development labeled Aspen Ridge Resort Expansion. Lucas studied the map for a long time, tracing the printed borders with his finger. His land, every acre he had worked for, was colored in corporate blue. That night he sat by the fire, reading through every page of his deed, the original survey and the notarized letters from the county recorder. Everything was in order. Yet, somewhere, someone had redrawn the lines. Outside, the engines roared again, echoing across the valley like distant thunder. Lucas watched through the window as the headlights of the trucks crawled up the slope, cutting through the snow. The mountain that had once been silent now hummed with the sound of intrusion, and a thought he had never known before began to take root: that even ownership could be temporary when power decided otherwise. The snow had barely melted when Lucas realized that the construction on the lower slope was not stopping. Each week, more machinery appeared, and the rough access trail he had carved months ago had been widened into a full gravel road that cut straight through the pine belt. He tried speaking with the site foreman again, hoping that a calm explanation and a copy of his title would settle things. But the man avoided eye contact and repeated the same phrase each time: "We're acting under HOA authority." When Lucas asked which HOA he was referring to, the foreman pointed toward a newly erected metal sign that read Aspen Ridge Homeowners Association, Community Development Zone. The words looked absurd against the backdrop of untouched forest. Lucas drove to the nearest town the next morning to find the HOA office and understand how his private mountain had suddenly become part of a community. The building was modern and glassy, standing on a busy commercial street. Inside, a receptionist in a tailored suit greeted him with professional detachment and asked for his lot number. Lucas handed her his deed and identification, but she merely frowned at the papers as though they were outdated. "Our records show this parcel within the Aspen Ridge Development District," she said politely. "It has been under HOA management since last year's expansion vote." Lucas explained that no one had ever contacted him about such a vote, that his land lay miles beyond the nearest subdivision, but she only nodded and promised that someone from HOA legal would call him. By the time he returned to his cabin, a printed envelope waited in his mailbox. It was a formal notice accusing him of unauthorized interference with community infrastructure and demanding immediate cessation of activity within the designated resort perimeter. He read the letter 3 times, trying to understand how the mountain he had legally purchased could suddenly belong to an organization he had never joined. The language of the document was calm yet vaguely menacing, filled with clauses about liabilities, assessment fees, and the HOA's right to recover losses from obstructed development. The total damages listed at the bottom reached $5 million. The absurdity of the figure made him laugh at first, but the laughter faded quickly when he saw that the notice included a case number and a deadline for response. It wasn't a prank. It was the first step of a lawsuit. Lucas contacted the county recorder's office again, sending digital copies of every document he owned. 2 days later, a clerk confirmed that, according to updated zoning maps, his mountain was now classified as part of the Aspen Ridge jurisdiction. When he asked who had approved the change, she hesitated before answering. "It appears to have been filed through a regional amendment," she said. "All the signatures check out on our end." Her tone suggested that she could not, or would not, say more. Lucas thanked her and hung up, his mind turning over the possibilities. Either there had been an enormous clerical error, or someone with influence had redrawn the lines deliberately. That evening he sat at the old wooden table in his cabin, spreading the letters, maps, and copies of deeds in a rough circle around him. The soft hiss of the wind outside felt heavier than usual, as if the mountain itself were listening. He remembered the first time he had stood at the ridge, feeling as though the land recognized him. Now the same ridge carried the rumble of engines and the flicker of floodlights that burned long after sunset. Every instinct told him not to let the situation drift into silence. He began drafting a formal response, quoting property law, attaching certified copies, and requesting an immediate cease and desist order. Before mailing the packet, Lucas decided to drive down to the site one last time and record what was happening. Using his old camera, he documented the heavy equipment, the stakes, the workers placing concrete foundations. Several looked uncomfortable when they saw him filming, while others continued without acknowledgement. At the edge of the clearing, a new boundary fence had been installed, topped with a plastic banner reading, "Future Home of Aspen Ridge Resort." His stomach tightened as he realized the fence line extended far above the boundary listed in his deed. Someone had used his land as a construction base and was now claiming it as part of an expansion that existed only on paper. The next morning, he emailed the footage to a local attorney recommended by the county clerk, a woman named Mia North who specialized in property and zoning disputes. She called him back within an hour. Her voice was steady and practical. "Mr. Bryant, what you're describing happens more often than people think," she said. "Large associations sometimes file jurisdictional expansions before confirming ownership. It's not always malicious, but it can become serious if they've already broken ground." She asked him to send every document he had. "We'll start with verification of the title chain," she added. "If your property was ever excluded from the HOA, we can use that." Lucas agreed, grateful for the calm efficiency in her tone, yet unease lingered after the call ended. He looked out the window toward the ridge where the machinery moved like small insects against the snow. The hum of engines traveled through the cold air, reaching his cabin in faint rhythmic pulses. He realized that the line between mistake and intent was already blurred, and that the next step, whatever it was, would determine whether the mountain remained his or became another entry in a corporate ledger. That night he sealed the envelope containing his legal documents, slid it into the outgoing mail slot at the tiny post office in town, and walked back through the quiet streets. The mountains loomed dark and silent above the horizon, their peaks catching the faint light of the moon. For the first time since buying the land, he felt not peace but a strange, growing tension, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath, waiting to see which law would prove stronger, the written one or the one carved by the wind and stone. Spring came late to the mountain that year, but when it did, it brought a different kind of noise. The forest, which once carried only the murmur of streams and the call of hawks, now pulsed with the mechanical rhythm of drills and engines. Lucas had grown used to distant sounds, but the new ones were closer, sharper, echoing through the valley with the metallic certainty of permanence. He no longer needed binoculars to see the movement below. Temporary office trailers had appeared. A tall crane stood like a silver spine against the blue sky, and trucks climbed the slope daily, spilling gravel across paths that had once been narrow, hiking trails. The sight made him restless. He contacted Mia again, and this time she suggested a meeting at her office in town. The drive took him nearly 2 hours, winding along a narrow highway where melted snow had turned the edges of the asphalt into soft mud. The HOA headquarters, she explained, had already filed a civil action claiming he had delayed their project by refusing access to community property. Mia had obtained the documents before their meeting, and when Lucas arrived, she was waiting with a thin stack of papers spread neatly across her desk. She looked composed but tired, as though she had spent the night preparing. "They're moving fast," she said, motioning for him to sit. "The suit isn't about money, it's about establishing control. If they can prove your lot is within their development zone, you lose jurisdiction, and they can build freely." Lucas leaned forward, scanning the forms. His name appeared in bold near the top, listed as defendant and obstructor. It felt surreal to see those words attached to him. "They're accusing me of damaging community property," he said quietly. "But I don't even belong to their community." Mia nodded. "Exactly. Which is why our next step is to prove the expansion vote was illegal. According to their own bylaws, any amendment requires the consent of all affected owners. I've already requested their meeting minutes and voting records. If they can't produce signed acknowledgement from you, that's a procedural violation." She paused and looked at him carefully. "However, we have to be prepared for resistance. These associations often rely on bureaucratic endurance. They assume you'll run out of patience or funds." Lucas gave a faint smile. They chose the wrong person for that. Over the next few weeks, correspondence multiplied. Certified letters arrived at his cabin almost daily, each more elaborate than the last, filled with demands, invoices for development fees, and formal warnings about his non-compliance. Lucas stacked them on the corner of his table like bricks, refusing to open most after photographing the envelopes for record. Mia advised him to document everything, including the construction activity on his land. He installed cameras along the lower trail and set up the motion sensors that transmitted images directly to his laptop. What he saw over the next several days confirmed what he already suspected. Crews were digging beyond their authorized area, cutting trenches for drainage and clearing patches of forest that lay squarely within his boundary lines. He sent the images to Mia, who replied within the hour. "This is solid evidence," her message read. "We'll file for an injunction to stop all work pending verification of ownership." For the first time since the ordeal began, Lucas felt a spark of hope. The mountain was scarred, but not lost. That evening, he walked to the ridge where the air grew thinner and colder. From there, he could see the valley spread wide, the construction lights glowing like artificial stars. He remembered the first winter, when only the sound of wind filled the space between the peaks. The view was the same, but its meaning had changed. What once felt infinite now felt occupied. 2 days later, while returning from town with supplies, Lucas found a temporary gate installed across the access road. A laminated sign hung from the chain declaring, "Authorized vehicles only." There was no lock, just the implication of one. He moved the chain aside and drove through, half expecting someone to stop him, but the road remained silent except for the hum of his tires. When he reached the upper slope, 2 security guards stood near the trailers, both wearing jackets with the Aspen Ridge HOA logo. One approached his truck, gesturing for him to lower the window. "Sir, this area is restricted," the guard said politely. Lucas replied calmly that he was the property owner, that they were on his land, and that any further obstruction would be documented and submitted to court. The guard hesitated, spoke quietly into his radio, then stepped back and let him pass. The encounter left Lucas unsettled. It was one thing to face paperwork, it was another to face people who believed they were enforcing rules. That night he wrote everything down, every word of the exchange, every detail of the new structures being built. He noticed that even small actions, like recording a video or sending an email, began to feel like acts of defense. The mountain, once a refuge, had turned into a case file, its silence replaced by legal language and construction reports. He wondered how many others had gone through similar battles, losing not through force, but through exhaustion. Yet despite the weight of it all, he refused to back away. When he looked at the boundary markers that now cut through his land like a scar, he thought of what Mia had said during their first call. They rely on people giving up. He wasn't ready to give them that victory. As spring deepened, the snowmelt swelled the rivers, and the construction crews pushed higher up the slope. Lucas knew the fight had entered a new phase. The legal paperwork could protect him only if it arrived in time, but the machines moved faster than any court schedule. Still, he believed that truth had its own momentum, slower but stronger. Standing outside his cabin one evening, listening to the sound of water rushing down the ravine, he realized that the mountain had begun to change him. It was no longer just the place he owned. It was the measure of how much he was willing to defend what was rightfully his. Summer arrived with dry heat and the kind of light that flattened distance, making the mountains look closer than they were. Lucas spent most of his days sorting through files, his living room transformed into a small archive of numbered folders and digital drives. The injunction Mia had filed was slowly moving through the court, though every new motion from the HOA added delay after delay. They argued that their expansion was of regional benefit, and therefore exempt from individual consent, while Lucas's documents, though clear, were questioned for technical details. A missing stamp, an outdated notary seal, an inconsistent coordinate on one of the maps. Each time Mia countered, the association replied with another layer of paperwork. It became clear that their strategy was not to win quickly, but to exhaust him. Then, almost unexpectedly, something shifted. One afternoon, Mia called with a quiet energy in her voice that Lucas had not heard before. She had obtained internal correspondence through a discovery motion, emails between the HOA board and a private development firm called Alpine Ventures. The messages referred to target parcels and integration incentives. In one of them, a project manager wrote, "If Bryant continues to resist, we can pursue financial damages for project interruption. His removal is non-essential but simplifies zoning." The words were precise, cold, and unmistakably incriminating. Mia summarized the implication. They knew your land wasn't included, and they built anyway. They counted on you being too isolated to challenge them. For a long moment, Lucas said nothing. He stared through the open door toward the slope where sunlight glinted off the metal structures, hearing the faint clang of machinery carried by the wind. It was one thing to suspect negligence. It was another to see proof of deliberate intent. The mountain that had once been a place of quiet work had turned into evidence in a growing case. Mia advised him to stay cautious but steady. "This is the point where they'll try to discredit you," she said. "They might question your surveys, even your residency. We'll use their own documents. they can't erase what's already been filed. In the following weeks, Lucas gathered every possible verification. He met a retired surveyor in town who had helped chart the area years ago and still kept the original plats on microfilm. Together, they compared coordinates, confirming that the boundary line on Lucas's deed matched the earlier county maps perfectly. The old man, leaning over the illuminated screen, muttered that he had seen creative redrawings before when property values rose. Lucas thanked him and paid for certified copies, then drove back through the canyon as storm clouds gathered behind the peaks. The air smelled of ozone and pine, and the first drops of rain began to tap against the windshield. For the first time in months, the mountain looked alive again, reclaiming its sound against the noise of engines. That night, the storm cut power to the cabin. Lucas lit the kerosene lamp and listened to the rain hammering the roof, thinking of how fragile ownership could be when paper could redraw what stone had defined for centuries. He imagined the unseen faces behind those emails, board members in offices miles away, making decisions that changed lives without ever setting foot on the ground they claimed. Yet the knowledge of their actions gave him an unexpected calm. They had crossed from arrogance into traceable misconduct, and that meant the truth could finally be proven. Mia arranged a meeting at the county courthouse to present the newly discovered material. The small courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish, the ceiling fans humming in slow rhythm. The HOA's attorney, a composed man in a navy suit, argued that the emails were informal exchanges with no binding authority. Mia responded with quiet precision, reading excerpts aloud until the judge raised a hand for silence. He requested that all construction cease pending verification of property boundaries. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was the first official pause in months. Outside the courthouse, the air was bright and warm. Mia turned to Lucas and said, "They're going to appeal, but for now, the machines have to stop." Driving back, Lucas noticed that the road leading to his property looked strangely empty without the constant movement of trucks. The silence returned, though it felt cautious, like the breath one holds before speaking again. He parked near the ridge and walked up the path, his boots pressing into soft soil still marked by tired tracks. The machinery stood idle, a frozen reminder of intrusion. He ran his hand over a piece of steel framing and felt the rough texture of rust beginning to form. Nature, slow but relentless, was already reclaiming what had been disturbed. That evening he received a short message from Mia. "Check your inbox. Local paper picked up the story." Lucas opened the link and read a short article titled, "Engineer Challenges HOA Over Mountain Expansion." It summarized the case with restrained language but quoted part of the internal correspondence. Within a day, the story spread online, gathering comments from residents in nearby communities who had faced similar disputes. Some wrote in support, others doubted his chances. Still, for the first time, he felt less alone. Over the next several days, as journalists requested interviews, the HOA released a public statement insisting that Mr. Bryant's claims are being reviewed through proper legal channels, and that community growth remains the association's priority. The tone was careful, avoiding direct denial. Mia saw it as a sign of weakness. "They're shifting to damage control," she said during their next call. "That means they know the optics have turned against them." Lucas, however, understood that publicity cut both ways. Attention brought sympathy, but it also raised stakes. The mountain, once his quiet retreat, was now a headline. He couldn't walk outside without imagining invisible eyes judging each move. When he looked at the slopes in the fading evening light, he felt both pride and weariness. The fight had become larger than him, an emblem of how easily private effort could be swallowed by collective entitlement. Still, amid the uncertainty, a new conviction formed, that truth needed persistence, not outrage. One afternoon he stood by the stream below the cabin, the water running cold and clear over stones, and thought about the first day he had arrived. Back then he had wanted solitude. Now he was learning the cost of it. The mountain had taught him resilience in its own language, slow, deliberate, unyielding. The documents, the hearings, the endless negotiation were all just human echoes of that same lesson. As the sun dipped behind the western ridge, the sky burned with a quiet orange, and Lucas felt, perhaps for the first time since the conflict began, that he was not only defending property, but something older and less tangible. The right to stand. Still when others demanded motion. By late summer, the pause on construction had turned into a slow stalemate. The court's temporary order remained in effect, but the HOA had filed an appeal, arguing that the injunction harmed community investment and risked significant economic loss. The phrase appeared so often in their documents that Lucas began to recognize it as a mantra rather than a statement. Mia warned him that appeals could stretch for months, sometimes years. The association's strategy was no longer a mystery. They aimed to wait him out until he surrendered or sold the property. Yet beneath their administrative calm, Lucas sensed restlessness. Small signs appeared near the boundary again. Survey flags, spray-painted numbers, and new stakes pressed into the soil as if someone wanted to remind him that the fight was far from over. He responded with precision rather than anger. Each marker was photographed, logged, and reported to the county with a copy sent to the court. He knew the HOA's council would dismiss it as routine maintenance, but every entry strengthened his record. Still, the persistence of those markers wore at him. The mountain that had once been an escape from bureaucracy now demanded the same level of discipline he had once reserved for engineering projects, documentation, timestamps, evidence management. He often woke before dawn to walk the perimeter with a camera, the cold air sharp in his lungs, the sky pale with the first hint of sunrise. The act grounded him, though at times it also deepened his fatigue. Mia continued to build the case, requesting access to additional records through discovery. One afternoon, she called to say that a former employee of Alpine Ventures had reached out anonymously. The person claimed that the development company and the HOA shared overlapping board members, an arrangement prohibited by local ethics regulations. The whistleblower offered to provide correspondence proving that land acquisitions were coordinated in advance of official votes. Mia was careful not to promise anything but said that, if authentic, the material could shift the case dramatically. "It's the kind of evidence judges remember," she said. "It shows intent, not error." Lucas felt the faint stir of hope again, mixed with unease about how deep the network might reach. Days stretched into weeks as they waited. Meanwhile, the practical costs of the legal battle grew heavier. The courier services, document fees, and travel expenses began to erode Lucas's savings. He found himself calculating how many months he could sustain the fight before needing to seek loans. Sometimes he considered selling a portion of the land to finance the rest, but each time he imagined signing away even a fragment of the mountain. Something in him recoiled. The struggle had become symbolic, larger than the boundary lines or the money. It was about the principle of ownership and the quiet conviction that the written law should still protect the solitary individual. Then the evidence arrived. Mia called late one evening, her voice brisk but contained. "It's real," she said. "We have the emails, the meeting notes, and even draft agreements for land transfers that predate their public vote by 6 months." She explained that one of the HOA board members also held a silent partnership in Alpine Ventures, effectively approving his own company's development rights. The revelation linked the entire expansion plan to self-dealing and potential fraud. Mia worked through the night preparing an amended complaint that included the new findings. "This changes everything," she told him the next morning. "They'll fight back hard, but now we have leverage." Lucas read the summaries she sent and felt a weight lift slightly from his shoulders. The words on the screen were dense, full of legal terminology, but their meaning was unmistakable. The mountain was never part of the HOA's legitimate jurisdiction. He walked outside, the air cool and clear after a night of rain. The valley spread out beneath him, quiet for the first time in weeks. The sound of water trickling through the rocks reminded him of how the place had once felt before all the arguments began. For a moment he allowed himself to imagine that peace could return, though he knew better than to trust it. Within days, the HOA issued a statement denying all allegations and accusing Lucas of orchestrating a media spectacle to damage their reputation. They hired a new legal firm, larger, more aggressive, and began sending formal requests for depositions. Reporters returned to the story, their headlines alternating between sympathy and skepticism. Some questioned whether an individual could truly stand against a corporate association. Others portrayed Lucas as a symbol of resistance. The attention brought more pressure but also new allies. Environmental groups, small property advocates, and residents from neighboring counties who had faced similar disputes. Their letters filled his mailbox, offering encouragement and caution in equal measure. Yet even as support grew, the tension deepened. The HOA's lawyers filed motions to inspect the property, claiming they needed to assess environmental impacts. Mia insisted on supervision for any visit, knowing how easily such inspections could be twisted into claims of violation. The day the inspection team arrived, Lucas watched them move through the land in bright safety vests, clipboards in hand, measuring, photographing, speaking in low voices. The sight was strangely invasive, more unsettling than any noise from machinery. When they left, he noticed how their footprints scarred the damp soil like temporary signatures of authority. That evening, he called Mia to ask whether they were winning or merely surviving. She paused before answering. "Both," she said finally. "But survival is the part that matters right now. Every day we stay in the fight, the truth gains weight." Lucas looked out at the horizon, where the setting sun painted the sky in muted gold. The light caught the new grass that had begun to grow where the construction had stopped, fragile yet persistent. It reminded him that recovery was a process measured not in sudden victories, but in slow, deliberate steps. The mountain was still his, not by grace of permission but by endurance. And endurance, he realized, was a kind of quiet power that even the loudest organizations couldn't easily take away. The hearing that would decide the future of the mountain took place on an early autumn morning, when the valley was covered with thin mist and the peaks gleamed white above it. Lucas arrived with Mia at the small courthouse that had become almost familiar, its pale stone walls and creaking wooden benches smelling faintly of varnish and paper. The courtroom filled slowly. Representatives from the HOA sat in one row, their attorneys whispering over folders embossed with the logo of Alpine Ventures, while a few local reporters waited near the back, notebooks poised. The judge, a quiet man known for his patience, called the session to order and asked both sides to present their final arguments. The air carried a tension that felt almost physical, as though the weight of months of conflict had condensed into the narrow space between the tables. Mia began with calm precision, her voice steady but clear. She walked the judge through the evidence, tracing the timeline from the moment Lucas purchased the land to the first appearance of construction equipment. Every document projected on the screen behind her seemed to build a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Boundary amendments filed without consent, zoning maps altered without public notice, and internal emails where board members discussed absorbing and outlying parcels. When she reached the message from the Alpine Ventures executive confirming that Lucas's removal would simplify jurisdiction, the room grew noticeably still. Even the HOA's lead counsel shifted in his chair, his composure slipping for a fraction of a second before returning to practice neutrality. When it was their turn, the association's lawyers tried to dismantle the narrative by invoking procedure and interpretation. They claimed that the overlapping roles between the HOA and Alpine Ventures were coincidental, that the correspondence was informal, that the expansion had been authorized under emergency provisions intended to stimulate local development. Their tone remained professional, yet each explanation sounded thinner than the last. Lucas listened without moving, his hands folded tightly on the table, the quiet hum of the air conditioning blending with the measured rhythm of legal language. He realized how detached it all felt, how a struggle that had consumed his every waking thought could be reduced to footnotes and citations. Still, he knew that this abstraction was where justice lived. In words, not emotion. When the final rebuttals ended, the judge asked a few brief questions, his expression unreadable. Then he announced a recess to deliberate. The pause stretched into hours. Outside, the courthouse lawn shimmered under the midday sun, and a soft wind moved through the maples that lined the street. Lucas stood by the window, watching the branches shift, and thought of the mountain waiting miles away, silent and unchanged despite the months of turmoil. He tried not to imagine outcomes, though every possibility seemed to pulse in his chest. At last, the clerk called everyone back. The judge's verdict was deliberate, measured, and unmistakable. He ruled that the HOA had acted beyond its jurisdiction by altering boundary designations without consent, that the collaboration with Alpine Ventures violated state ethics statutes, and that all construction permits related to the expansion were void. The order required the immediate restoration of the site and recognized Lucas Bryant as the sole lawful owner of the property. As he read the final line, awarding damages to cover legal costs and environmental remediation, the courtroom remained silent. The words fell like steady rain, washing away months of uncertainty. Mia exhaled quietly and turned to him with a faint, tired smile. Lucas felt an odd mix of relief and disbelief, as though his body hadn't yet caught up with what his ears had heard. The HOA representatives gathered their papers in silence, avoiding eye contact as they left the room. Outside, the reporters waited, but Lucas had little to say beyond a few sentences about fairness and persistence. His voice trembled slightly, not from excitement but from the exhaustion that follows a long climb. Driving back toward the mountains that evening, he noticed how the light changed across the ridges, the clouds casting slow-moving shadows that looked almost like breath. The machines were gone, the air clear again. When he reached the gate at the base of his property, he stopped the truck and stepped out. The gravel crunched under his boots, and a cold wind swept down from the summit, carrying the faint scent of pine and snow. For the first time in almost a year, the mountain sounded the way it had when he first saw it, empty, vast, alive. He understood that the victory was less about possession than restoration, a return to the balance that greed had tried to distort. That night he built a small fire outside the cabin and watched the flames rise against the dark. The legal battle had ended in words, but the meaning of it lingered in silence. He thought of all the people who had written to him during the fight, strangers who had faced their own versions of the same struggle. Their stories had reminded him that isolation was never absolute, that even a single voice, when sustained long enough, could echo far beyond the boundaries drawn on a map. As the firelight flickered across the rocks, Lucas felt the fatigue settle into something gentler, a quiet certainty that what had been defended was more than land. It was the idea that truth, when recorded with care and patience, could still stand firm against the noise of power. Weeks passed before the mountain truly felt quiet again. The workers never returned, and by early winter the first snow erased the last marks of construction, covering the broken soil with a clean white layer that seemed to forgive what had been done. Lucas spent those days repairing the cabin roof and clearing the stream, small tasks that felt ceremonial, as if restoring order to the ground itself. Letters continued to arrive from journalists and neighbors, some congratulatory, some simply grateful that someone had proved such resistance was possible. He answered few of them, preferring to let the noise fade while he learned to live normally again. The silence he had once feared losing returned in a different form, no longer fragile but earned, carrying the faint echo of all that had been endured. Mia visited occasionally to finalize paperwork and discuss the ongoing investigation into the HOA's practices. The association's board had resigned, and the county announced plans to review every boundary change filed in the past decade. She spoke of reforms and new oversight committees, but Lucas listened with a half-smile, knowing that bureaucracy would always rebuild itself. What mattered was that, at least once, the pattern had been interrupted. One evening they stood outside the cabin watching the last light fade over the ridge, the air crisp with the smell of pine and frost. Mia said quietly that the mountain looked different now. Lucas shook his head and replied that it had always been the same, only he had changed. When she drove away down the winding road, the sound of her engine faded until there was nothing but wind. Lucas walked to the edge of the slope where the view opened to the valley, the horizon stretching wide beneath a pale sky. He thought of how fragile ownership seemed when reduced to documents, yet how powerful it became when defended with persistence. The world below glimmered faintly in the distance. Towns, lights, movement, but here everything was still. He breathed in the thin, cold air and felt the quiet settle deep inside him like a final verdict. The mountain belonged to him again, but more than that, he belonged to it. And for the first time in a long while, both seemed at peace.